Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Let's launch into a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read chapter 13 of The Lives of Brian by AC/DC's lead singer Brian Johnson. Without further ado, let's dive in to chapter 13. A month after the triumph of All Because of You entering the top 10, we found ourselves in Torquay on the coast of Devon. It was Easter Monday, April 23rd, 1973. The date sticks in my mind because it was one of those days where the universe seemed to be trying to tell me something. Now, Torquay is only about 50 miles across the English Channel from France. We had been told that it had a near-tropical climate with palm trees lining the streets. And being naive Geordies, we believed it, booking ourselves into a B&B right on the seafront and making sure to pack our swimming trunks and suntan lotion. It was the coldest night in Torquay's history. The wind blowing in from the channel was just as bad as the North Sea gales back home, and it wasn't raining, it was sleeting. Earlier that morning, there had even been a layer of frost on the ground. Our accommodation was one room between 4 grown men, with each of us on one of those little divan beds that you fall out of if you roll over in the night. The paint was peeling off the walls. The sheets were made from the kind of nylon that gives you electric shocks whenever you move. And of course, there was no heat, unless you fed 5-pence pieces into the meter in the room, which we stopped doing when we realized 5 pence got you about 5 minutes of warmth. The heat just went straight out of the cracks around the window frames. At least we had a place to sleep. In those days, the owners of B&Bs were notorious for giving away your room before you showed up, especially if you got in late. Not that our landlady was in any way welcoming. I locked the door at midnight on the dot, so if you're not back by then, hard luck. As for breakfast, she added, there'd be a toaster and some bread made available at the crack of dawn for about 20 minutes. And if we miss it, I asked, you'll do without. The show that night was at Torquay Town Hall. Everyone from the Rolling Stones to the Who had played there, and David Bowie was booked to do a show a few months after us. The first thing we noticed when we pulled up was the bus parked outside. Not a normal bus, but a gigantic American model from the early 1950s with stainless steel side panels and a bullet-shaped back end. It was a flexible Clipper, which I later found out had been built for an Australian tour operator, which explained why it was right-hand drive. I couldn't believe that anyone had managed to get a vehicle of that size and shape into the country. Whose is that? Must be the support bands, shrugged Vic. Support bands were usually even more broke than we were, so how could they afford transport like that? When we walked in, the support band in question were still on stage with about 15 minutes left to go, so we got some beers in, sat down at the bar, and had a listen. The band were from Australia and had just changed their name from Fraternity to Fang after messing up their UK debut the previous year. I couldn't stop looking at the lead singer because he was one of the wildest looking cats that I had ever seen. Coconut bob hair, one tooth missing, Abe Lincoln beard. He looked like an elf. But me, the guy could sing. What he was singing wasn't rock and roll though. It was more like prog folk, along the lines of Jethro Tull's Living in the Past, only proggier and folkier. At one point, he even whipped out a wooden recorder and started to play it in a way that would have brought tears to the eyes of Miss Patterson, my old teacher. Then at the end, he swapped the recorder for this thing that looked like a cross between a bong and a rocket launcher. It was a bassoon, apparently. As Fang finished up, we drained our beers and headed backstage. "Who's that singer?" I asked a guy wearing a now out-of-date fraternity t-shirt. Because, there was no doubt about it, Bon Scott was clearly no ordinary singer. I'd love to tell you that I made a note to look up all of Bon's previous work, but Fang weren't really my cup of tea, and by the end of the night, we were exhausted and frazzled from the show and from all the driving earlier on in the day. So we headed back to the B&B, teeth just chattering in the cold, and the decision was made to break open the coin box on the meter so we could keep putting in the same 5 pence over and over again. It worked like a charm, but just as we were finally starting to warm up, tap, tap, tap. "What's that noise?" asked Tom. "Tap, tap, tap," hissed Vic. "The landlady must have heard us breaking the coin box. Quick, put it back on." A mad scramble followed as we tried to unbreak the electric meter until we realized that the knocking wasn't coming from the door, it was coming from the window. Then we heard the whispers. "Psst! Hey lads, open the window. It's us, Fang." I was drunk and I can't remember much, but I am told that when we pulled back the curtains, there was Bon and a couple of the boys from Fang shivering on the street outside. Their tour bus had broken down, which meant no heater. And because the bus's side panels were made of stainless steel, it had become like a fridge inside. A mechanic was already working on it, they said. Although where on earth they had found a guy in Torquay at 11:30 p.m. on an Easter Monday who knew his way around a big block American diesel, I had no idea. Whatever the case, Fang desperately needed somewhere to get out of the cold, especially since it had started to sleet again. So we forced open the window sash and heaved the boys from Fang inside, while trying not to wake the landlady. I'm not sure if this really happened, but I was told it did. But being so drunk, I have an excuse. Eventually, Fang's roadie knocked on the window to say that he had finally got the bus started again. The next night, we played at Plymouth Guildhall, with Fang once again in support. I remember nothing of the show, apart from the fact that about 2/3 of the way through, I suddenly got an absolutely terrible pain in my gut and collapsed on the stage and started to roll around, moaning and howling. The crowd thought it was all part of the act and were lapping it up and going crazy. So I forced myself back on my feet and carried on with the song that I was doing, but that was it. We finished 20 minutes earlier. I was off to A&E. I had come down with a bout of appendicitis. Not bad enough to require emergency surgery, thankfully, but I did need to go on a long course of antibiotics. The tour went on regardless, night after night, 6 or 7 days a week. We were driving hundreds of miles a day, sometimes in the Granada, sometimes in the van. But we were so young and so excited, and our hopes were still so high, it was a magical time. I never saw Bon again, I'm very sorry to say, but it's so strange to me that our fates entwined on that one night on the Torquay seafront in the freezing cold. I wish that I could have got to know him better. On the road, it was becoming increasingly obvious that Geordie were two different bands. The first band was just kind of poppy and played songs like Don't Do That and All Because of You, with the teeny bopper magazines running profiles on us and organizing competitions like Win a Day with Geordie at a fun fair. The other band, meanwhile, was represented by tracks like Black Cat Woman and Keep On Rockin', and had more in common with Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath than anything glam. But the press only ever seemed to notice the first band and kept comparing us with Slade, which started to get pretty frustrating after a while, and our management was firmly of the opinion that we belonged in the pop world. I wasn't so sure, and one of the moments that persuaded me was in, of all places, Fastlane Submarine Base. Geordie were playing at the base club. We were headlining, and a Scottish band called Nazareth were the support. I had never heard of them. Not many people outside of Glasgow had. Before the show, I started chatting with their singer Dan McCafferty, and we got on immediately. We were from the same background of council houses and industry, and both had been apprentices. The audience was made up of uniformed sailors, and some in their civvies. They lined the walls and bar that surrounded the dance floor, and then in came the girls. It was the perfect Friday night for a fight, especially because submariners didn't like sailors and vice versa. The air was electric with trouble. You could actually touch it. Dan said, "Well, we better get on before they get a wee edgy." I thought I'd stay and watch, and Nazareth came on and started. I was mesmerized. It was a thunderbolt. They were loud and rocking, and so very tight, and I thought, I want to be in a band like that. All the tenseness went out of the room. Everybody was locked into this brilliant band. The next thing I thought was, how the are we going to follow that? They finished a house of more, more. And then it was our turn. Although we were a tight, rocky little band, our singles had been a tad poppy. We gave it our best shot. The boys were playing up a storm, but we were following a hurricane and a tornado all in one. Halfway through the set, I saw the first bottle fly at the sailors, and then a chair at the submariners, and then the world went mad. There was blood. There were people running on stage for safety. These were not Jolly Jack tars. We somehow kept going. It was a madhouse. Military police were called, and it slowly emptied. Dan came over and gave me a whiskey and said, "Oh, do not worry. It was much worse last week." We worked our arses off during the rest of 1973 to try and build on the success of All Because of You and get to the next level. But our album, Hope You Like It, wasn't selling enough to turn us into a proper headline act, meaning we had to keep putting out more singles to keep the momentum going. We released 3 more singles that year: Can You Do It, Electric Lady, and Black Cat Woman, with only Can You Do It getting into the top 20. The others didn't even chart. As much as this wasn't exactly an encouraging sign, we just thought we needed a new album. So back we went to Pi Studios in Marble Arch and Lansdowne Studios in Holland Park, with the wildly eccentric Roberto De Nova once again producing, and we made Don't Be Fooled by the Name. For the cover photo, we dressed up like Al Capone-style gangsters, complete with black hats and black suits, me with a cigar in my mouth. The idea being that we had grown up a bit after the more light-hearted Hope You Like It. One of the best parts of making the album for me was getting to know Andre Jacquemin, a composer, producer, and arranger who had just moved his studio from his dad's greenhouse into Red Bus's building on Water Street. He was the guy who Monty Python used to produce all their albums. He'd later write the James Bond-esque theme tune for Life of Brian, and being a massive Python fan myself, I couldn't hear enough of his stories. Mind you, Andre also nearly got us both in trouble because he had a Bond bug, which was a 3-wheeled microcar shaped like a wedge, with screens instead of doors. It looked like a slice of orange with a sense of humor. It only came in that color. But Andre was so proud of it, he insisted on taking me for a ride, and we very nearly ended up under the wheels of a London bus. Another memorable moment for me from those studio sessions was when we recorded our cover of The House of the Rising Sun, which I had first performed all those years ago at Sunnyside Working Men's Club. After running through it a few times, I felt like I had nailed the vocals, but Roberto kept saying, "It's just them missing something." Then, inspiration struck, and he started rushing around the studio, setting up microphones all over the place, and making all these humming noises into them. When he was done, the track began with what sounded like a drone, which fitted the dramatic, ominous tone of the song perfectly. Not that anyone ever heard it, of course, because no one bought the album. A tour of Australia and Japan was seen as the answer to our problems, so in early 1974, we packed our bags and off we went. We had to sit all the way in the back of the plane, obviously, but we stocked up on duty-free tabs and whiskey and spent most of the flight getting through it all. Even when they banned smoking on flights in the 1980s, routes to Australia were exempt because no one could go on without a tab for that long. It felt like it took 3 days to get there. Actually, it probably did. We flew to Bahrain first, then to Singapore, then on to Sydney. But we didn't care because we were so excited, especially when the Australian promoter, who was a bit of a lad, told us that we'd be staying on Bondi Beach. We couldn't believe that we'd be right there on the shore of the South Pacific, looking out over the beach, and all the Aussie girls in their tiny bikinis. And we were right not to believe it, because it was absolute bull. We had a room with 2 bunk beds, no view, and no air conditioning, a good mile from the ocean. Then all the other usual scams began. We had to rent the PA system from the same guy who was doing our booking. His wildly overinflated fee deducted from the ticket sales before we saw a penny. And the guy in charge of transport supplied us with an old post office van, not a real truck. But we couldn't pick up the phone to Ellis and ask him to sort it out. Once you were down under, you were down under, mate. Our first show was a festival-type deal at E.S. Marks Athletic Field, a big open-air space with a covered grandstand, and we were the headliners. When we went on, it felt like Woodstock. Big stage, big sound system, huge crowd of several thousand Aussies, everyone cheering and whooping. It was fantastic. A huge morale booster. But 2 days later, we were playing a working men's club out in the sticks in the middle of the afternoon when it was about 120 degrees in the shade. The place was an absolute dump. All tin huts and rusted out cars. The crowd was small, sweaty, and drunk, and didn't much care for palms. Later, as we were getting out of our stage gear in the dressing room, a huge snake appeared, and the 4 of us bolted out of there in our underpants, screaming. I mean, we were Geordies. The only snakes we'd ever seen were in Tarzan movies. When we told the venue manager, he muttered, "Palms," strolled into the dressing room, came out holding the snake, and went, "It's not even poisonous, you wankers." At which point we began to suspect that somebody had deliberately put it there. By the time we got back to Sydney, we were starting to wonder if the tour had ever been a good idea. In the meantime, though, we discovered these amazing parks where you could bring your own steak and beer and make your own barbecue. And we went to the pictures to see The Exorcist, which scared the living out of us. The climax of the trip was 2 nights at Checkers, the famous Sydney nightclub, and on one of those nights, if I had known where to look, I could have seen Malcolm Young standing at the back. He had gone there to pick up a check that he was owed by the venue management, but decided to stay for the show, having heard about my James Brown antics from Bond. I don't know if it's true, but I heard Angus was there a week later when we played the Hornsby Police Boys Club out in the Sydney suburbs. Not to see us, he was just there. There was no writhing around on the floor and moaning for me on either of those nights, of course, although, as usual, Tom Hill spent a lot of both gigs on my shoulders. Then it was time to fly to Tokyo, where we were met by the legendary promoter, Mr. Udo, who had organized Led Zeppelin's tour of Japan a couple of years earlier. We couldn't believe Japan. It was just stunning. No dirt on the street, construction workers who bowed, everyone wearing white gloves, taxis with doors that opened automatically. We even got a room each at the hotel, an unheard of luxury. Mr. Udo took us to dinner at a teppanyaki place, where the Kobe beef was as tender as marshmallows. It was hands down one of the best meals of our lives. We were also introduced to sake, which we started to guzzle down in mugs. This was good stuff, and if you drank enough of it, you started to sing Japanese folk songs in Japanese. We did about 4 shows in Japan, if I remember correctly, traveling between them via bullet train, something that I had heard of but almost didn't believe existed. It was an extraordinary experience, sitting in the restaurant car of a train going at over 100 miles per hour. No rattles or shaking. The Japanese really were light years ahead of the rest of the world. The gigs were strange affairs, though. You'd play a song and get a little ripple of polite applause at the end. Then, silence. You couldn't help but wonder if they even liked the music. Then, at one show, a guy got so excited he stood up and clapped. He was promptly grabbed by security and thrown out. We ended the year supporting Deep Purple on their tour of Germany. This was going to be pretty exciting. They were absolutely huge. But the contrast between the success we enjoyed and Ritchie Blackmore's juggernaut, the latest Deep Purple album, Burn, had become a top 10 hit on both sides of the Atlantic in spite of a radical lineup change that saw David Coverdale take over from Ian Gillan on vocals, was stark. I mean, the fans at those shows had come to see only one band, so even though we were doing well and the band was tight, no one was really paying attention. Another of the support acts on that tour was the sensational Alex Harvey Band, fronted by the Glaswegian madman of the same name. His live version of Delilah, heavier and darker than the original, to put it mildly, was something to behold, and would become a top 10 hit for him the following year. At the time, though, Alex was still a cult act, and like us, very much in the shadow of Deep Purple. "You know, Brian," he said to me before one show in his broad Glaswegian accent, "the secret to success in this business is that you've got to get a reaction. That's how you make an impact. So, I think I'll switch up the show a wee bit tonight." I didn't think much more of it until 8 p.m., when it was time for Alex to make his usual entrance against a moodily lit brick wall holding a can of spray paint. He'd then graffiti the word Bambo on the wall. The lights would come up, and the band would launch into the blistering wah-wah guitar intro of a song called Bambo Marble Eye. Bambo being some kind of superhero figure from Alex's imagination. The howls of shock and boos of disbelief were deafening. Glasses and chairs flew at him, but he just smiled and waved back before making a very swift exit. I was at the side of the stage when he came off. "Now that's a reaction," he grinned as he rushed by, and we were next. Thanks, Alex. The guy just had no fear whatsoever. He was also one of the most gifted lyricists I ever met. His songs like The Faith Healer, Hammer Song, Sergeant Fury, and Boston Tea Party are absolute classics. Do yourself a favor and listen to all of his albums. My last encounter with Alex was in our shared dressing room at a point in the tour when I was starting to get friendly with one of his girlfriends, a dark-haired German lass who dressed entirely in shiny black leather, from her skirt to her knee-high boots. She was hot, to say the least, especially since her accent kept giving me flashbacks to my night in the Nettles around the back of Walker Boys Club. On the night in question, the girl had decided to hang out in the dressing room during Alex's show, and when she realized that we were alone, she gestured to me in a way that didn't require any translation. Next thing I knew, her skirt was up, my trousers were down, then right on cue, in walked Alex, and we were caught. "Johnson," he boomed, pointing his cane at me, "that's my cabaret, I want a report on my desk in the morning, in triplicate." No fallout, no repercussions, just a sly wink. To this day, I have never met another man like him. God bless you, my son. Jordy desperately needed to try something new, given that Don't Be Fooled by the Name had failed to produce a single hit. But what ended up happening made no sense to me at all. All of a sudden, Vic just wasn't there anymore. To this day, I have no idea what happened. No one told me anything. One minute, Vic had been our main songwriter and guitarist. The next, he was out of the band, which seemed very unfair given that he had been the one who put the band together in the first place. The lead guitarist ended up being a guy named Mickey Bennison, an old friend of Tom's. He was a nice lad and a good guitarist who loved American cars and had an import business nicknamed Third Leg Motors. But by the time we'd put some new songs together and gone back on the road, nobody cared. And when we played the old Geordie songs, they just sounded so dismal and undistinguished without Vic's guitar sounds. Worst of all, now that I was stuck in the back of a van with a guy I barely knew, it just wasn't fun anymore. All of the camaraderie had gone. It was clear that Tom and the other Brian had also lost their enthusiasm. When we got back from Germany, they opened a shop in Newcastle. It was called Geordie the Boutique, just across from the Theatre Royal, and it took up most of their time. Tom was a bit of a fashionista, and he'd go shopping down in London and bring up all the latest clobber, the stuff you couldn't find up north. And then the two of them would resell it. They seemed much more excited about that than Geordie. Meanwhile, I was just sitting around waiting for something to happen. My 45 pounds a week salary was put on hold for weeks at a time because we were no longer playing regularly. Not because we didn't want to, but because we couldn't get any gigs. Reality was starting to bite, and it was apparent we were past our sell-by date. Then one night, a guy from EMI Records came up to Newcastle and took me out for an Indian meal. He asked me what I was doing with myself these days. "Nothing much, to be honest," I said. Then he asked me if I'd ever consider working for a record company. "Oh, I'd love to work for a record company," I told him, not really taking the question seriously. "They always seem to have more money than me." "You could be a rep," he replied, looking me directly in the eye, at which point I realized that this wasn't a hypothetical conversation. He was actually sounding me out for a job. "You really think I could do that?" I asked. "Of course," he said. "You're a funny guy, you get on well with people, you've been on top of the pops. That's exactly what we need. You'd be a huge asset for the company." "Oh, mate," I said, trying not to get emotional. "That would be a dream come—" "We could also get you a company car." "Okay, where do I sign?" I said. I wasn't joking. Unfortunately for me, though, the EMI guy went out for dinner the next night with the radio presenter James Whale, then a friend of mine and the host of Night Owls on Metro Radio. And thinking he had my best interest at heart, James talked the guy out of making the offer official. "Oh, no. Brian's no good for that. He's a singer," he told him. "You can't ruin his career by making him a record rep." I needed the money so badly. "You moron! Why did you say that?" James was unapologetic. He told me that he had just spoken his mind, that he truly believed that I was destined for bigger things. I didn't know whether to say thank you or you. The situation at home was dire, but I couldn't face the thought of going cap in hand back to Parsons and asking for my old job. The smug, "I told you so" lectures that I'd get from the likes of Harry Blair would be unbearable. Besides, my old job probably didn't exist anyway. As for going on the dole, I was too proud to take money from the government. Carol was at her wit's end. We both were. And of course, that kind of stress isn't exactly conducive to marital bliss. We were constantly at each other's throats. Then one day, the phone rang. "How's my favorite rock star?" asked the instantly familiar voice on the other end of the line. "I'm broke, Ellis, because you're not paying me," I replied through gritted teeth. "Really? Gosh, well, I'll have to talk to accounts about that. That doesn't seem right. Anyway, how would you like to come down to London and start work on the new album?" "What new album?" "The new Geordie album." "Ellis, there's no Geordie without Vic. It's not the same. Anyway, I'm done with this business. It's just one scam after the other, and I can't take it anymore. I need a real job." Said Ellis, thinking for a moment. "What if we got you a new house? Would that help?" "Oh, for God's sake," I thought. Here we go again. Well, that's the end of chapter 13. Let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.